Volkswagen did not fail quietly. For decades, it was the largest automaker on Earth, 650,000 employees, 120 manufacturing plants, a brand so embedded in German identity that its collapse was considered structurally impossible. You've probably driven one, or trusted one, or assumed one would last. The Golf, the Passat, the Tiguan. Names that meant something beyond transportation. But sometime between the boardroom projections and the public announcements, the numbers stopped matching the story. Plants are closing. Workers are being cut. Profits have collapsed. And the official explanations don't come close to accounting for what the internal documents show. Volkswagen did not build its dominance quietly. It built it visibly, methodically, over 8 decades until the company was not just the largest automaker on Earth, but a piece of German infrastructure. 650,000 employees, 120 manufacturing facilities across multiple continents, a domestic workforce so large that entire cities were engineered around a single logo. You've probably driven one, or trusted one, or inherited one from a parent who swore by the brand. The Golf, the Passat, the Tiguan. Names that carried a specific promise. German precision, German reliability, German permanence. But somewhere between the boardroom projections and the public announcements, the numbers stopped matching the story. Plants are closing now. Workforce reductions are being announced in figures that don't happen by accident. And the official explanations don't come close to accounting for what the internal records show. The hard numbers arrived publicly in late 2023 and accelerated through 2024. Operating profit margins collapsed to levels not seen since the Dieselgate fallout. Volkswagen Group announced plans to close at least 3 German plants, the first domestic plant closures in the company's entire history. 60,000 jobs identified for elimination. Labor costs described as unsustainable. The supervisory board convened emergency sessions. The press releases used words like restructuring and transformation. Those words explain nothing. They are the institutional equivalent of a closed gate with no sign explaining why it's locked. What those announcements did not explain is the timeline. Internal cost analyses flagged structural overcapacity in Volkswagen's European manufacturing network as early as 2020, not as a projection, as a documented problem requiring documented action. The public did not learn about these findings in 2020. They learned about them in 2024, when the situation had deteriorated past the point of quiet resolution. The company acknowledged the production inefficiencies when pressed. It did not explain why 4 years passed between internal identification and public disclosure. That gap is not an oversight. Gaps of that size are decisions. Dieselgate casts a shadow here that the official narrative would prefer to leave unexamined. In 2015, Volkswagen was caught using defeat device software to falsify emissions readings across 11 million vehicles globally. The software had been in active use for years before regulators discovered it. Internal engineers knew. Compliance teams knew. The question of who in the management structure knew and at what level of seniority was never fully resolved in public. 30 billion euros in fines, settlements, and legal costs later, the company described Dieselgate as an aberration, a failure of certain individuals, contained and corrected. What it actually demonstrated was a corporate culture in which inconvenient information could be managed, delayed, and selectively surfaced. That culture did not dissolve with the settlement payments. The China exposure follows the same pattern. By 2023, Volkswagen derived approximately 40% of its global unit sales from the Chinese market. That dependency was visible in annual reports for years. What was less visible, because it was not disclosed with the same clarity, was how rapidly that market position was eroding. Chinese domestic manufacturers, led by BYD and a restructured domestic EV sector, began displacing Volkswagen in segments the company had dominated for a decade. Market share did not drop suddenly. It dropped steadily. in figures that were available to internal forecasters long before they appeared in investor communications. Independent analysts flagged the China revenue concentration as a structural vulnerability in 2021 and 2022. The internal forecasts accounting for accelerated Chinese competition were not released. Some executives described the China situation as a correction. Others called it a transition. None of them called it what the market share data had been showing for 3 consecutive years. The ownership structure of Volkswagen is not complicated. It is something more useful than complicated. It is insulated. The German state of Lower Saxony holds a 20% ownership stake and carries blocking minority rights under a special legislative arrangement known as the VW law. The Porsche Piech family controls the majority of voting shares through Porsche Automobile Holding SE. IG Metall, Germany's largest industrial union, holds seats on the supervisory board and represents a workforce whose job security is structurally embedded in the company's governance. These 3 stakeholders do not share identical interests. They share one interest. None of them benefit from early, public, unambiguous bad news. The state needs the employment numbers for electoral reasons. The family needs the valuation. The union needs the headcount. What none of them needed, institutionally, was a frank accounting of structural decline delivered ahead of schedule. The supervisory board reviewed the long-range production forecasts. Those forecasts were not released. This is not a conspiracy. It is something more durable than a conspiracy. It is an incentive structure. When every party inside a governance framework has a reason to delay disclosure, disclosure gets delayed. Independent analysts who modeled Volkswagen's European overcapacity problem were working from public data the company itself had filed. They were not permitted access to internal production utilization figures. Their conclusions, published in 2022 and 2023, described a manufacturing footprint that had not been rationalized to match actual demand for over a decade. The company did not respond to those assessments with counter data. It responded with the language of ongoing evaluation. Evaluation, in institutional terms, is what happens when an answer exists, but releasing it is inconvenient. Wolfsburg is not a city that exists independently of Volkswagen. It was built for the factory. The factory defines the tax base, the school system, the housing market, the local political calculus. Zwickau retooled its entire plant for electric vehicle production, the first fully electric Volkswagen factory in Germany, and then watched EV demand projections miss by margins that triggered worker displacement the transition was supposed to prevent. Emden, Hanover, each facility carrying a workforce, a community, a municipal budget anchored to a single employer's internal decisions. The workers in those plants did not receive early warnings. They received announcements. There is a difference between being informed and being notified, and Volkswagen's workforce learned which category they occupied in the same news cycle as everyone else. The electric vehicle transition remains the unresolved center of the entire failure. Volkswagen committed tens of billions of euros to electrification, announced ambitious production targets, and watched delivery figures fall short of projections as Chinese competitors captured the market segments the investment was designed to defend. The ID.3 launched late. The ID.4 underperformed in markets where BYD had already established pricing and range benchmarks that Volkswagen's cost structure could not match at comparable margins. The pivot was announced with the language of vision. The execution produced numbers that belong to a different document than the vision statements. Who authorized the gap between those two documents, the projections and the results, is a question the supervisory board has not answered in public. The audits continue. The explanations don't. What is happening at Volkswagen is not, finally, a story about cars. It is a story about what occurs when an institution's survival depends on managing what the public is permitted to understand, and for how long. The crisis was not created in 2024. It was disclosed in 2024. Those are not the same event, and the people responsible for the difference between them have not been identified by name.